Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today we've got something a little different.
Yeah.
We're not talking about, good deeds or anything like that.
Right.
We're going to be looking at speech in Islam
Okay.
and, the kind of speech that's most displeasing to Allah.
Interesting. It's really interesting how much emphasis Islam places on our words.
Right. You'd think it would be like, outright lies or something like
Yeah,
that.
exactly. Like the really bad stuff.
Yeah. Or, just being straight up, mean to somebody.
Right. Insults and things.
Yeah. But the article zeroes in on this very specific phrase
Oh, okay.
that's considered particularly disliked by Allah.
Huh. I'm intrigued.
Yeah. And it's something you might even hear like in casual conversation.
Really? So, like, what is it? What's this phrase?
Okay. So picture this. Someone's giving advice, about being a better Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, fear Allah, trying to guide them.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And the person replies, worry about yourself.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem. It sounds so dismissive.
It is. And that dismissiveness, I think that really gets to the heart of the matter.
What do you mean?
Well, in Islam, giving and receiving advice, especially about faith, that's considered a really important act.
Oh, okay. Yeah, like an act of caring for another person.
Exactly. It's about looking out for each other, in this life and the next.
That makes sense.
So when someone just brushes that off with a worry about yourself, it's like they're rejecting that care.
And rejecting the guidance, too.
Yeah. And that's where the arrogance comes in.
Arrogance.
Yeah, because by saying worry about yourself, they're implying that they don't need any guidance.
Oh, I see. Like they're already perfect.
Exactly. Like they're above needing advice from anyone.
So it's not really about the advice itself, but the attitude behind the response.
Right. It's like their pride is blocking them from even hearing what's being said.
And that pride, that's the arrogance the article's talking about.
Exactly. And, this idea of humility being so important in Islam, that's all over the Quran.
I'd imagine so.
Yeah, and the article even quotes a verse from Surah An-Nahl, 16.23.
Which says?
It says, indeed, Allah knows what they conceal and what they declare. Indeed, he does not like the arrogant.
Wow. So there's a direct link between arrogance and something that Allah dislikes.
Yeah, and it's not just about what we do, but what's in our hearts.
That's deep.
It is. And that worry about yourself response, that's like a flashing sign of that inner arrogance.
Yeah. It's like saying, I don't need you or your advice.
Exactly. It shows a heart that's closed off, not open to learning or growing.
That's a powerful image. And it makes me wonder, what about the opposite? Is there a phrase or an attitude that's particularly pleasing to Allah?
That is such a good question. And you know what? The article actually addresses that too. It talks about how even a simple phrase said with sincerity can raise a person's rank in the eyes of Allah.
Really? So it's not always about grand gestures.
No, not at all. Sometimes the smallest things can have the biggest impact.
That's encouraging.
It is. And the article quotes another hadith about this. It says, a servant may utter a word which pleases Allah without giving it much importance, and because of that, Allah will raise him many degrees in rank. And a servant may utter a word which displeases Allah without giving it much importance, and because of that, he will be cast into hellfire.
Wow, that's quite a contrast. So on one hand, you have that dismissive phrase rooted in arrogance, and on the other, even simple good words can have incredible weight.
It's about the intention behind our words, isn't it?
Yeah, and how they reflect what's truly in our hearts.
Exactly. Our words have power, even the ones we don't think much about in the moment.
It really makes you think about how we use our words every day, doesn't it?
It does. And how those words can have consequences that go way beyond what we intend.
Absolutely. It's a reminder to be mindful of our speech and to use it for good whenever possible.
I couldn't agree more. So we've been talking about how even a simple phrase like worry about yourself can be a sign of arrogance.
Right, and how that arrogance is something Allah dislikes.
Exactly. And it's not always about being outwardly boastful or anything.
Yeah, arrogance can be sneaky. It can show up in ways we don't even realize.
That's what's so interesting about this article. It mentions that even a speck of arrogance in our hearts can keep us out of paradise.
Wow. Yeah, that's a pretty serious consequence.
It is. And it makes me wonder, how else does this arrogance show up in our lives?
Well, think about it. Arrogance is basically like a resistance to growing as a person.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's that voice inside that says, I already know everything, or I'm already good enough.
So it's like a barrier to self-improvement.
Exactly. And that can show up in so many different ways.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Okay, so imagine someone who's always criticizing others, but never seems to see their own faults.
Oh, yeah, I know people like that.
Right. Or someone who always has to be right in every conversation.
They're a know-it-all.
Yeah. They might have strong personalities, but underneath it could be that sense of superiority.
Like they think their perspective is the only one that matters.
Exactly. And that can really damage our relationships, you know?
How so?
Well, arrogance makes us defensive and judgmental. It's hard to connect with others when we're always putting up walls.
So it's like we're too focused on protecting our ego to really see the other person?
Right. And that's why humility is so important.
Mm-hmm.
It's about letting go of that ego and approaching others with openness.
Okay, so how do we make that shift from arrogance to humility?
It's not easy, but the article reminds us that we need to be aware of our flaws and seek guidance.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If we're pretending to be perfect, we'll never see our weaknesses.
Exactly. Humility allows us to admit that we don't have all the answers and that we're always learning.
So it's about being open to growth.
Yes. And that's crucial for both our spirituality and our relationships.
It sounds like humility is more than just a personal virtue. It's about creating a more harmonious way of being.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's a journey that requires constant effort and awareness.
Because we're all going to stumble sometimes, right?
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
But the key is to keep striving, keep reminding ourselves of the importance of humility.
This is really making me think. You know, we started with just one phrase, but it's opened up this whole discussion about arrogance and humility.
Yeah. It's amazing how much depth there is to this topic.
And I'm sure our listeners are finding it just as thought-provoking as I am. Okay, so we've been exploring this idea, that arrogance is really disliked in Islam.
Right.
And it's not always obvious, how it shows up.
Yeah, it can be super subtle.
But now I'm wondering about the practical side of things,
Mm-hmm.
How do we actually cultivate humility?
It's $1 million question, right?
It is. Like, where do we even start?
Well, the article focuses more on the spiritual side of things.
Yeah.
But there are definitely some practical steps we can take.
Okay, I like that.
Mhm.
So what are some things we can do?
One really powerful practice is gratitude.
Gratitude.
Yeah, taking time to really appreciate all the good things in our lives,
Okay.
both big and small. It helps shift our focus,
From what?
from what we lack to what we've been given.
Oh, I see.
It helps us realize that everything is a gift.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in, wanting more and more.
Exactly. But gratitude is like an antidote to that.
To that feeling of entitlement.
Yeah. It helps us be more humble.
And appreciate what we already have.
Right. And it reminds us that we're not self-made.
Oh, I see.
We've all been supported and helped along the way.
So it's about recognizing that interconnectedness.
Exactly. And that naturally leads to humility.
Okay, so gratitude is one thing. What else can we do?
Another important practice is mindful listening.
Mindful listening.
Yeah, like really paying attention to others without interrupting or.
We're trying to force our own opinions on them.
Right. It's about showing respect and being willing to learn.
And it helps us see the value in other perspectives, even if we don't agree.
Exactly. We can learn so much from listening to others.
And it ties back to receiving advice, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, if we're really listening, we're more open to considering the advice.
Even if it's hard to hear.
Yeah. And it helps us let go of that need to be right all the time.
Exactly. It's about being open to different viewpoints.
So cultivating humility is really about developing empathy and compassion, too.
Absolutely. When we approach others with humility, we see them as equals.
And we treat them with kindness and respect.
Right. It all comes back to that inner state,
Yeah, our words and actions reflect what's in our hearts.
Exactly. So if we're cultivating humility inside, it will show up in how we treat others.
This has been such a great deep dive. We started with one little phrase.
I know, right?
And it's opened up this whole discussion about arrogance and humility.
And how to actually live a more humble life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what are your final thoughts for our listeners?
I would say embrace the journey of cultivating humility.
Yeah.
It's not always easy, but it's so worth it.
Why is that?
Because it leads to greater self-awareness, deeper connections, a more meaningful life, really.
Wow. That's beautiful.
Thank you. And remember, it's a lifelong journey.
We're all going to make mistakes along the way.
We are,
Right?
but that's okay. The important thing is to keep learning and keep growing.
This has been so inspiring. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for sending in your questions and keep them coming. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.